welcome to Holloway Archives. Before we delve into today's haunting tale from the depths of Appalachian history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these forgotten tales of America's hidden past. The Appalachian Mountains, with their deep valleys and dense forests, hold stories as ancient as the very rocks that support their steep slopes. These mountains have witnessed centuries of human struggle, triumph, and tragedy. They've sheltered generations of families who carved out lives in the most remote corners of America, sometimes so isolated from civilization that they developed their own codes of survival, their own interpretations of morality, and their own dark secrets that would remain buried for decades. It is in this isolated setting that our story begins, in McDowell County, West Virginia, around 1923. This was a time when the outside world seemed impossibly distant to the families nestled deep in these mountain hollows. The nearest town was often a day's journey away, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths that became completely impassable during the harsh winters. Here, generations of families remained isolated from the outside world for months at a time, creating their own insular communities where the normal rules of society didn't always apply. The Hollister family lived in a small log cabin situated at the very end of a winding dirt road that snaked its way up the mountainside through dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine. This road, barely more than a rutted trail carved out by generations of wagon wheels and horse hooves, became completely impassable during the harsh Appalachian winters. Snow would pile up to 6 feet deep, and ice would make the already treacherous path absolutely deadly. The cabin was so isolated that for 4 or 5 months each year, from late November through early April, the Hollisters saw no one but themselves. No visitors, no neighbors, no contact with the outside world whatsoever. This isolation, while providing a certain protection from the judgments and interference of the outside world, would also become the perfect setting for a tragedy that would span multiple generations and leave scars that would take decades to heal. Jeremiah Hollister was the patriarch of this isolated family, a tall, bony man standing well over 6 feet, with angular features carved sharp by years of mountain living. His thick, unkempt beard was streaked with premature gray, and his penetrating blue eyes seemed to hold secrets that he never shared with anyone. Those eyes could be kind when he chose, but more often, they held a coldness that made even grown men in town uncomfortable. Jeremiah had been widowed at the age of 42, left to raise his daughter Martha alone after a tragedy that would haunt their family forever. Martha was a delicate girl, small-boned like her mother had been, with fine features and the same striking blue eyes as her father. Her mother, Sarah, had died during an exceptionally difficult childbirth when Martha was only 6 years old. It had been a winter birth, with no doctor available and only the help of a neighboring woman who had limited experience with such complications. The baby, a boy who would have been Martha's younger brother, didn't survive either. The loss of both wife and son in a single night transformed Jeremiah from a reserved but generally pleasant man into someone much darker and more withdrawn. Since that terrible winter night, father and daughter had lived alone in that small cabin, their world shrinking to just the two of them, and the mountains that surrounded them like prison walls. The closest neighbors, the McKenzie family, lived almost 10 kilometers away down treacherous mountain paths, and visits between families were rare even during the best weather. The journey was simply too dangerous and time-consuming for casual social calls. The pastor from the small Baptist church in town tried to visit the isolated families in his congregation once a year, usually during the summer months when travel was possible. Reverend Thomas Mitchell was a dedicated man who took his pastoral duties seriously, but even he found the journey to the Hollister cabin challenging and somewhat unsettling. During his annual visits, he noticed disturbing changes in Martha as she grew from a child into a key plant teenager. The girl who had once been bright and talkative became increasingly withdrawn with each passing year. She would avoid direct eye contact with him or anyone else who visited, keeping her arms crossed protectively over her body, and speaking only when directly addressed, and then only in whispers. By the time Martha was 14, Reverend Mitchell noted in his private journal that the girl seemed almost fearful of human contact. She would flinch when someone reached out to shake her hand or pat her shoulder in a friendly manner. There was something haunted in her eyes, a premature understanding of adult cruelties that no child should possess. When he asked Jeremiah about Martha's education and social development, the man would give vague responses about her being shy and needing time to mature. Jeremiah was always a strange man, recalls Elenina Davis, now 93 years old, and one of the few people still alive who actually knew the Hollister family during those early years. Her memory of those days remains sharp despite her advanced age, and she speaks with the careful precision of someone who has carried certain knowledge for decades. Even before Sarah's death, he rarely came down to town. When he did appear, he would conduct his business quickly and efficiently, speaking to people only when absolutely necessary. It was always Sarah who came to buy supplies for the family, making the dangerous journey down the mountain path on horseback. Elenina remembers Sarah Hollister as a nervous woman who always seemed to be in a hurry during her visits to town. She would arrive at the general store with a carefully written list, purchase exactly what was needed, and then leave immediately. She rarely engaged in the casual conversation that was common among the mountain women when they came to town. She was always looking over her shoulder, as if she feared someone might follow her back up the mountain. We all thought it was just the natural caution of someone who had to make such a dangerous journey alone, but now, looking back, I wonder if there was something more to her nervousness. Local residents began to comment on the strange dynamic between father and daughter during the rare occasions when they appeared together in the village. These appearances became even less frequent after Sarah's death, but when they did occur, they left lasting impressions on those who witnessed them. Martha seemed like a shadow of her father, always walking exactly one step behind him, never speaking unless he gave her permission to do so, and even then responding only with monosyllables when someone tried to engage her in conversation. The local storekeeper, Henry Watson, noted that Martha never made eye contact with anyone and seemed to shrink into herself whenever her father wasn't looking directly at her. It wasn't natural, he would later tell his wife. Most mountain children are shy around strangers, but Martha acted more like a beaten dog than a young girl. There was a fear in her that went beyond normal shyness. The winter of 1937 was particularly severe in the mountains, with snowfall beginning in early November and continuing almost without interruption through March. Temperatures dropped to levels not seen in over a decade, and even the hardiest mountain families struggled to survive the brutal conditions. It was during this isolated winter that Martha, then 20 years old, became pregnant with her first child. With no access to medical care or even contact with other women who might have provided guidance and support, Martha faced her pregnancy alone except for whatever help her father provided. The isolation that had always characterized their lives became even more complete during these crucial months. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt enough to make travel possible, Martha didn't come down to town with her father, as she had occasionally done in previous years. It was during a routine supply run that rumors began to circulate among the townspeople. Jeremiah was seen at the general store purchasing baby clothes, small blankets, infant gowns, and other items clearly intended for a newborn. When Henry Watson cautiously asked about the purchases, Jeremiah's response was characteristically brief and emotionless. "My daughter is expecting," was all he said, his face remaining as impassive as the mountain rocks that surrounded their home. He offered no additional information about when the baby was due, who the father might be, or how Martha was managing her pregnancy in such isolation. Suspicions began to grow among the local residents, though these suspicions were voiced only in whispers and behind closed doors. Martha had not been seen in the company of any young men from the area. In fact, she had rarely been seen in public at all during the past few years. No one could remember any young men making the treacherous journey up the mountain to court her, and given the isolation of the Hollister cabin, it seemed impossible that she could have met someone without the knowledge of the tight-knit mountain community. The community began to whisper increasingly dark theories about the situation. Some suggested that perhaps Martha had been involved with someone from outside the area, maybe a traveling peddler or seasonal worker who had passed through the region. Others whispered even darker possibilities, though these were spoken so quietly that they were barely audible, even among the closest of friends and family members. It was Dr. William Foster, the only doctor within 50 miles of the area, who was finally called to the Hollister cabin on a rainy night in June 1938. Dr. Foster had been serving the scattered mountain communities for over 20 years, and he had seen more than his share of difficult births and family tragedies. He was a practical man, not easily shocked, but he was unprepared for what he would find in that remote cabin. The call had come through a complex relay system that the Mountain families used for emergencies. A neighbor had spotted smoke signals from the Hollister property, a predetermined distress signal that meant immediate medical help was needed. Dr. Foster had made the treacherous journey up the mountain in darkness, following dim lantern light and familiar landmarks, his horse picking its way carefully along paths made slippery by the spring rains. Martha was in labor when he arrived, and serious complications had forced Jeremiah to swallow his pride and seek outside help. What Dr. Foster found in that dimly lit cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life and would be recorded in detail in his private medical journal, a document that would not be discovered until after his death decades later. Martha, pale and fragile from months of inadequate nutrition and no prenatal care, was giving birth to a girl. But even in the dim lamplight, Dr. Foster's experienced eye immediately noticed facial features and physical characteristics that alerted him to the strong possibility of consanguinity, the medical term for children born from close blood relationships. The baby girl was born with several characteristics that were tragically typical of children born from incestuous relationships: a visibly underdeveloped jaw that would make feeding difficult, extra fingers on both hands, and what appeared to be serious heart defects that caused her skin to have a bluish tinge even immediately after birth. Despite Dr. Foster's best efforts and years of medical experience, the infant survived only 3 days. During those 3 agonizing days, Dr. Foster remained at the cabin, trying everything he could to help the struggling newborn. But the genetic damage was too severe. The baby's heart simply couldn't sustain life, and she passed away on a quiet morning as the sun was rising over the mountain peaks. Throughout this ordeal, Martha never once mentioned who the child's father was, maintaining a silence that seemed both stubborn and terrified. But Dr. Foster's suspicions were carefully recorded in his private diary, along with disturbing observations about Jeremiah's behavior that confirmed the doctor's worst fears about the situation. Jeremiah seemed more devastated by the child's death than would be expected of a grandfather, Dr. Foster wrote in his journal. He held her tiny body as if she were his own daughter, not his granddaughter. He cried in a way that made me look away, as if I were witnessing something too intimate, too sacred in its perversity. The grief was that of a father losing his child, not a grandfather losing his grandchild. The way he touched her face, the way he whispered to her, it all spoke of a relationship that went far beyond what should exist between grandfather and grandchild. In those isolated mountains, where the law rarely reached and social conventions were often adapted to harsh realities, it wasn't entirely uncommon for families to intermarry to keep land and property within bloodlines. Cousins married cousins, and occasionally uncles married nieces in arrangements that were designed more to preserve family holdings than to follow conventional moral standards. The harsh realities of mountain life sometimes required flexibility in social conventions that would be unthinkable in more populated areas. But even in this context of relaxed social conventions, certain boundaries were still respected by even the most isolated communities. The relationship between father and daughter represented a taboo that few communities, no matter how isolated or unconventional, would tolerate. It was a line that was not supposed to be crossed under any circumstances, a boundary that represented one of the most fundamental rules of human society. After the death of Martha's first daughter, a heavy silence descended upon the Hollister cabin like a shroud. The loss seemed to drain what little life had remained in the isolated homestead. For almost a year, no one in town saw Martha at all. Jeremiah continued to make his periodic supply runs to town, but he came alone, speaking even less than usual, and avoiding any attempts at conversation with the shopkeepers or other townspeople. Those who observed him during this period noted that he seemed to age rapidly. His hair became completely gray, and his already lean frame became almost gaunt. But there was something else in his demeanor, something that several townspeople later described as a kind of desperate possessiveness. When asked about Martha's health or well-being, he would give curt responses that discouraged further questions. "She's fine," he would say. "She just needs time to recover." In April 1939, Martha became pregnant for the second time. The news reached the community through the same network of whispered conversations and careful observations that had marked her first pregnancy. Again, Jeremiah was seen purchasing baby supplies, and again, no one could identify any possible father other than the increasingly obvious and horrifying reality that most people refused to voice aloud. The second child, a boy named Elijah, was born at home with the help of a local midwife, Ida Mae Jenkins. Ida Mae was a woman in her 60s who had assisted with dozens of births throughout the mountain communities over the course of her lifetime. She was known for her practical approach to childbirth and her ability to handle even the most difficult situations with calm efficiency. But her experience at the Hollister cabin shook her profoundly. That house had a strange smell. Ida Mae reported years later to her closest friend, speaking in the hushed tones that people reserve for discussing the most disturbing subjects. There was something that reminded me of a wounded animal, an odor of despair and resignation that seemed to permeate everything. The cabin felt like a place where hope had gone to die. And when I saw the baby, I understood why. The boy was born with several visible deformities that immediately indicated the genetic consequences of inbreeding. His fingers were fused together in a way that formed claw-like appendages that would make normal hand function impossible. His eyes were different colors, one blue like Jeremiah's, the other brown like Martha's, a condition called heterochromia that, while not always indicative of genetic problems, in this context suggested chromosomal abnormalities. Most concerning to Ida Mae's experienced eye was the abnormally large size of the baby's head, a clear sign of hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the coccyda, brain, causing the skull to expand and often leading to severe developmental delays and early death. The condition was unmistakable to anyone with medical knowledge, and Ida Mae knew immediately that this child faced significant challenges. That boy won't survive the winter, Ida Mae told Jeremiah frankly, as she had learned over the years that mountain families preferred direct honesty about medical situations rather than false comfort. Jeremiah received this devastating news with nothing more than a stoic nod, as if he had expected such a prognosis. There was no surprise in his reaction, no emotional outburst, just the grim acceptance of someone who had already witnessed too much tragedy. Surprisingly, Elijah not only survived that first winter, but continued living for the next 5 years, defying all medical expectations. However, his survival came with severe limitations that made his life a constant struggle. He never learned to speak more than a few disconnected words, and his movements remained severely limited throughout his short life. His motor skills never developed beyond those of a very young child, and he required constant care and supervision. Martha carried him everywhere during these years, even as he grew larger and heavier, making the physical burden almost unbearable. She seemed to find some kind of redemption in caring for him, as if her devotion to this damaged child could somehow make up for the circumstances of his conception and birth. Neighbors who occasionally glimpsed them during rare trips to town noted that Martha seemed to find a kind of purpose in her role as Elijah's constant caregiver. During these 5 years, Martha became pregnant 2 more times, each pregnancy bringing its own tragic consequences. The third child, a girl named Ruth, was born in 1941, with less immediately visible physical deformities than her older brother, but her mental development was clearly compromised from birth. She would never develop beyond the mental capacity of a young child, though she did show some aptitude for simple tasks and seemed to respond well to music and gentle voices. The fourth child, another boy, was still born in 1944 and was buried in the small family cemetery behind the cabin, without ceremony or community acknowledgement. The graves in that little cemetery were marked only with simple wooden crosses bearing carved names and dates, creating a sad chronicle of the genetic consequences of the forbidden relationship that had produced these children. That family always had problems with babies who were stillborn or died early, explains Harlan Thompson, a local historian who has spent decades researching the genealogical patterns of Appalachian families. Records show that the Hollister family came to these mountains in the 1820s, part of the Great Migration of Scots-Irish settlers, who pushed westward, seeking land and opportunity. But since their arrival, they had married almost exclusively among cousins and other close relatives, creating a pattern of consanguineous marriages that concentrated problematic recessive genes. This pattern of intermarriage wasn't unique to the Hollister family. Many of the mountain families had similar histories, as the isolation of their communities naturally limited marriage options. But the Hollisters seem to have taken this tendency to an extreme that created a concentration of genetic problems that manifested in increasingly severe ways with each generation. In 1945, tragedy struck the family again when Elijah, then 6 years old, succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. His weakened constitution, already compromised by his genetic conditions, couldn't fight off the respiratory infection. Martha was seen at the small funeral holding Ruth's hand. Ruth was now 4 years old and, while clearly developmentally delayed, had formed a strong attachment to her older brother. Neighbors who attended the simple burial service noticed that Martha appeared to be pregnant again, though she tried to hide her condition under loose clothing. The sight of this woman, barely in her 20s but already worn down by multiple pregnancies and the care of disabled children, carrying another child that would likely face the same genetic challenges, was heartbreaking to those who witnessed it. Martha's 5th child was born in June 1946, a girl who was named Sarah in honor of Martha's deceased mother. This child was different from her siblings in ways that would prove crucial to the family's future. Unlike her older brothers and sister, Sarah appeared relatively healthy at birth. Her eyes were a deep blue, almost identical to Jeremiah's, and her early development seemed to follow normal patterns. Sarah's apparent normality brought about a significant change in Jeremiah's behavior that was noted by everyone who had contact with the family. He began taking her along when he went to town, exhibiting her with a pride that local residents found deeply disturbing given what they suspected about the family's situation. He treated her as if she were his own daughter, not his granddaughter, recalls Clementine Parker, who worked at the general store during those years and had frequent opportunities to observe the family dynamics. He would constantly show off how smart she was, how quickly she learned new things, how well behaved she was. The resemblance between them was undeniable. Same eyes, same facial structure, same mannerisms. But there was something possessive in the way he looked at her that made everyone uncomfortable. As Sarah grew, it became increasingly evident that she had somehow escaped the worst genetic consequences that had afflicted her older siblings. By the age of 5, she was attending the local school sporadically during the warmer months when travel to and from the isolated cabin was possible. Her teacher, Miss Abigail Wilson, was a young woman fresh out of normal school who had come to the mountains filled with idealistic notions about bringing education to isolated children. Miss Wilson quickly noticed that despite some learning difficulties, Sarah was slower to read than other children her age and had trouble with certain mathematical concepts. She was considerably more advanced than her sister Ruth and showed signs of genuine intelligence that just needed proper nurturing and development. It was through Sarah's attendance at school that the outside world began to get glimpses of the true nature of life in the Hollister cabin. Children, with their natural honesty and lack of understanding about what should be kept private, often reveal family secrets that adults work hard to conceal. On a rainy autumn day in 1952, Sarah showed up at the one-room schoolhouse with a visible bruise on the side of her face, a dark purple mark that she couldn't hide despite her efforts to keep her head turned away from the other children and the teacher. When Miss Wilson gently questioned her about the injury, Sarah initially gave the standard explanation that mountain children were taught to give for such marks. She had fallen while doing chores around the cabin, but later that day during lunch break, Sarah approached Miss Wilson with the kind of innocent directness that only children possess when they're confused about adult behavior they don't understand. The words she spoke would haunt Miss Wilson for the rest of her life and would finally bring outside attention to the situation in the Hollister cabin. Daddy got angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore, Sarah said with the disconcerting innocence of a child who doesn't understand the significance of what she's revealing. He says Mommy is his, that she always has been since Grandma died. But Mommy cries at night, and I don't understand why Daddy gets so mad when she tries to sleep in her own bed. Miss Wilson felt her blood turn cold as she realized what the 6-year-old was telling her. The rumors and whispered suspicions that had circulated through the community for years were being confirmed by the innocent words of a child who had no understanding of the horror she was describing. That evening, Miss Wilson wrestled with her conscience and her duty as both a teacher and a moral person. She knew that she couldn't ignore what Sarah had told her, but she also understood the complexities of interfering in mountain family situations, especially one involving people as isolated and potentially dangerous as the Hollisters. After a sleepless night, Miss Wilson decided to report the incident to the local sheriff, John Buchanan. Sheriff Buchanan was a practical man who had been dealing with the complex social dynamics of mountain communities for over 15 years. He listened to Miss Wilson's account with growing concern, but he was also aware of the legal and practical challenges involved in investigating such allegations. Without concrete evidence beyond a child's account, he explained to the young, "Teacher, there's very little I can do legally, These mountain families have their own customs and ways of handling internal matters. It's not our role to interfere unless there's a clear and immediate danger that we can prove in court. Sheriff Buchanan's reluctance to intervene wasn't entirely due to respect for mountain customs. The Hollister cabin was extremely isolated, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths that would be dangerous for a law enforcement officer to navigate alone. Jeremiah Hollister was known to be heavily armed, as were most mountain men, and any confrontation could easily turn violent. Without solid legal grounds for intervention, such a confrontation could result in tragedy for everyone involved. The winter of 1952 to 1953 was another particularly harsh season that further isolated the Hollister cabin from the outside world. Heavy snows began falling in early November and continued with unusual severity through March. Even the hardiest mountain families struggled with the extreme conditions, and several people died from exposure or illness during those brutal months. When spring finally arrived and the snows began to melt, Martha was seen in town with Ruth and Sarah, but her appearance shocked those who remembered her from previous years. She looked worn down and aged far beyond what her 36 years would suggest. Her hair had streaks of premature gray, and she had lost significant weight, giving her a gaunt, almost skeletal appearance. Most alarming to those who observed her was the complete absence of Jeremiah during these spring visits to town. It was only in July 1953 that the truth about Jeremiah's absence came to light, and it came through the accidental discovery of a hunter who had become lost in the dense mountain forests. Joseph Miller was an experienced outdoorsman who had been tracking deer through unfamiliar territory when he found himself disoriented and unable to find his way back to familiar landmarks. Following what appeared to be an old logging trail, Miller eventually came upon the Hollister property. As he approached the cabin to ask for directions back to town, he noticed something that struck him as significant. There was a recent grave in the small family cemetery behind the cabin. The wooden headstone was newly carved and clearly marked with Jeremiah Hollister's name and the date of his death, January 12, 1953. I thought it was strange that no one in town knew he had died. Miller later told Sheriff Buchanan when he reported his discovery. A man doesn't just die in these mountains without word getting around, especially during winter when everyone checks on their neighbors to make sure they're surviving the harsh conditions. But what Miller found even more disturbing than the unreported death was what he observed through one of the cabin windows as he was preparing to leave the property. Martha was sitting at the rough wooden table with Ruth and Sarah, and for the first time in anyone's memory, she seemed genuinely peaceful. There was a lightness in her posture and expression that hadn't been seen in years. It was as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, Miller reported. She was actually smiling while she helped Sarah with what looked like schoolwork, and she seemed relaxed in a way that I'd never seen during the few times I'd encountered the family in town. It was the look of someone who had finally been freed from some terrible burden. The summer of 1953 brought dramatic changes to what remained of the Hollister family. With Jeremiah's death, Martha seemed to have discovered a freedom that she had never known existed. She began making regular trips to town, sometimes bringing both girls with her, and for the first time in anyone's memory, she engaged in normal social interactions with other members of the community. Martha established a small vegetable garden near the cabin, something she had apparently been prevented from doing during Jeremiah's lifetime. The garden flourished in the mountain soil, providing fresh vegetables that significantly improved the family's nutrition and health. She also began allowing Sarah to attend school regularly rather than just sporadically, giving the intelligent child the consistent education she needed to develop her natural abilities. Ruth, although still clearly limited in her mental development, began to show signs of improvement in her behavior and social skills. Away from Jeremiah's oppressive presence, she became less withdrawn and fearful, and she began to develop some surprisingly sophisticated skills in sewing and handicrafts that would later become sources of both pleasure and modest income for the family. It was during this period of gradual healing and normalcy that Martha encountered Jacob Wheeler, a middle-aged widower who had recently moved to the region seeking a fresh start after his own family tragedies. Jacob was a skilled carpenter who had come to the mountains hoping to find peace and perhaps redemption in the simple life that the isolated communities offered. Jacob Wheeler was a quiet, thoughtful man in his mid-40s who had lost his wife to tuberculosis after 20 years of marriage. Childless and devastated by his loss, he had sold his carpentry business in Virginia and moved to the West Virginia mountains, hoping that physical labor and spiritual solitude would help him heal from his grief. Unlike most local residents, Jacob didn't listen to or participate in the gossip and rumors that surrounded the Hollister family. He had his own painful past to deal with, and he understood that everyone carries burdens that outsiders can't fully understand or judge fairly. Everyone has a past, he would say when people tried to warn him about getting involved with Martha and her children. What matters is the present, and how we choose to live from here on. I'm not interested in judging this woman based on rumors and speculation about things that may or may not have happened before I even knew she existed. The friendship between Martha and Jacob developed slowly and carefully, built on casual encounters at the general store and brief conversations after Sunday religious services at the small Baptist church. For Martha, who had lived her entire adult life under the oppressive control and abuse of her father, Jacob's simple kindness and respectful treatment felt like water in the desert. Jacob never pressed her for information about her past or demanded explanations for the rumors that surrounded her family. He seemed to understand instinctively that she had survived something terrible, and that she needed time and space to heal. His approach was patient and gentle, offering friendship and support without demanding anything in return. In October 1953, after months of careful courtship, Jacob asked Martha for permission to formally court her with the intention of eventual marriage. The request shocked Martha, who had never imagined that any decent man would want to associate with her, much less marry her, given what she assumed everyone knew or suspected about her past. The community's reaction to Jacob's interest in Martha was a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and outright disapproval. How could a decent, respectable man like Jacob Wheeler be interested in a woman with Martha's history and reputation? What kind of man would willingly involve himself with a family that carried such dark secrets? But secrets in small communities, no matter how carefully guarded, rarely remain buried forever. Someone always knows the truth. And eventually, that truth has a way of surfacing, often at the most unexpected and devastating moments. On a crisp Sunday afternoon after church services, Clementine Parker approached Jacob in the church parking lot with the kind of determined expression that indicated she had something important and probably unpleasant to share. Clementine was one of those people who seemed to consider herself the unofficial moral guardian of the community, and she clearly felt that Jacob needed to be informed about what he was getting himself into. "You know who those girls, Father, is, don't you?" she asked, her voice low but loaded with unmistakable insinuation and moral judgment. Jacob, genuinely confused by the question and increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, replied that he assumed the father had been Martha's deceased husband, though he realized that he had never actually heard anyone mention Martha being married. Clementine let out a dry, humorless laugh that carried years of accumulated gossip and community speculation. "Martha was never married, Jacob. Those girls, their father is the same man who was Martha's father. Jeremiah Hollister kept his own daughter as his wife, if you understand what I'm saying. You're getting involved with a cursed family, and if you have any sense, you'll stay away before you become part of their tragedy." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow, leaving him feeling dizzy and nauseated. He drove aimlessly through the winding mountain roads for hours, trying to process what he had just learned and struggling to reconcile this horrific information with the gentle, damaged woman he had come to care for. When he finally returned to town, night had already fallen, and the mountains were bathed in the silver light of a full moon. Despite the late hour, Jacob found himself driving to the Hollister cabin, drawn by a need to confront this revelation directly rather than let it fester in his mind. Martha was sitting on the small front porch as if she had been waiting for him, and her first words confirmed that she had been expecting this conversation eventually. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm, but filled with the resignation of someone who had always known that her secrets would eventually be exposed. Jacob nodded, still unable to find the right words to express what he was feeling. Not just the horror of what had been done to her, but also the growing compassion and protective instincts that were warring with his shock and revulsion. "I understand if you never want to see me again," Martha continued, her voice steady despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. "But before you go, I'd like you to hear my story. Not the rumors and speculation that people have been whispering about for years, but the truth of what actually happened in this cabin." And so, under the brilliant canopy of stars that stretched across the Appalachian sky, Martha Hollister told her complete story for the first time in her life. She spoke of how the abuse had begun shortly after her mother's death, when she was just 14 years old and still grieving the loss of the only person who had ever protected her. She described how her father had gradually isolated her from any possibility of outside help or escape, using her love for her deceased mother's memory and her fear of the dangerous mountain wilderness to keep her trapped in the cabin. She told Jacob about her attempts to resist, including one desperate effort to run away when she was 16, only to be tracked down and dragged back to the cabin, where Jeremiah had chained her to the bed for weeks as punishment. The chains had left permanent scars on her ankles, scars that she had hidden under long skirts and boots for her entire adult life. Martha spoke about the pregnancies, the births, the deaths of children who had been conceived in violence and born into a world that could never accept them. She described her love for these damaged children, despite the circumstances of their conception, and her desperate efforts to protect them and give them whatever happiness was possible in their short, difficult lives. "I love them, you know," she said, tears streaming down her face as she spoke of Ruth and Sarah and the children who had died. Despite how they were conceived, despite the deformities, despite everything that was wrong about their existence, they were my children. I wanted to protect them, to give them some chance at life, some possibility of happiness. Jacob listened in complete silence, his heart torn between horror at the story he was hearing and growing compassion for the woman who had endured more than anyone should ever have to bear. When she finally finished speaking, they sat in silence for several long minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what had been shared. "And Jeremiah," Jacob finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "how did he die?" Martha looked up at the star-filled sky for a long moment before answering, and there was something in her expression, a slight hesitation, a brief shadow that crossed her features, that made Jacob wonder if he was about to hear the complete truth. "The winter was harsh," she finally said, her voice steady but somehow distant. "He got sick. Pneumonia, probably. He refused to go down the mountain to see the doctor, said that doctors were just charlatans who wanted to take people's money. One morning, he simply didn't wake up." There was something in the way she said it, an almost imperceptible pause before she spoke, that made Jacob suspect there might be more to the story than she was telling. But who was he to judge this woman? After everything she had endured, what right did he have to demand complete honesty when she had already shared more painful truth than most people reveal in a lifetime? On the day he died, Martha continued, and now her voice carried a note of something that might have been relief, or perhaps liberation. "I felt like I could breathe for the first time in decades. It's a terrible thing to say about your own father, I know, but it was as if a shadow had been lifted from this entire mountain, not just from me, but from the girls too. For the first time since I was 14 years old, I went to sleep without fear." Jacob reached out and took Martha's hands in his, a simple gesture of human compassion that made her eyes fill with tears again. Her hands were rough and calloused from years of hard mountain living, but they trembled slightly at his gentle touch, the touch of a man who meant kindness rather than harm. "No one should have to go through what you went through," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of anger at what had been done to her and admiration for her strength in surviving it. "No one should have to endure that kind of life, especially not for so many years." At that moment, Sarah appeared at the cabin door, her blue eyes, Jeremiah's eyes, wide and uncertain in the darkness. She had clearly been awakened by the sound of voices and was concerned about finding a stranger on their porch so late at night. "Mommy," she called, her voice small and worried. "Is everything all right? Who is that man?" Martha turned to her daughter with a gentleness that Jacob found deeply moving. "It's all right, dear. This is Mr. Wheeler, and we're just talking. Go back to bed now, and don't worry about anything." Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking cautiously at Jacob with the wariness of a child who had learned early to be suspicious of adult men. But something in Jacob's calm, non-threatening demeanor must have reassured her, because she nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. "She looks like him," Martha said softly after Sarah had gone inside. "Sometimes when I look at her, I see Jeremiah's eyes looking back at me, and my heart freezes for a moment. But then she smiles or says something kind, and I remember that she is not him. She is herself. Despite everything, she has his eyes, but she has none of his cruelty, none of his darkness." The following months brought a kind of healing routine to the Hollister cabin that none of them had ever experienced before. Jacob visited regularly, helping with repairs and improvements to the property and bringing small gifts for the girls, books for Sarah, who was proving to be an eager reader, and colorful threads and fabrics for Ruth, who was developing remarkable skill in needlework and embroidery. The transformation in Martha during this period was nothing short of remarkable. The woman who had once flinched at the slightest unexpected sound and avoided all eye contact with other people began to display a cautious but genuine warmth. She started smiling occasionally, something that shocked the longtime residents of the community who remembered her previous fearful, withdrawn demeanor. Jacob's patient, respectful courtship allowed Martha to experience for the first time what a healthy relationship between a man and woman could be like. He never demanded anything from her, never raised his voice in anger, never made her feel threatened or unsafe. For someone who had known only abuse and violence from the primary male figure in her life, this gentle treatment was revolutionary. But the relationship between Jacob and Martha became the primary topic of conversation throughout the small mountain community. The local gossips had plenty to say about what they viewed as an inappropriate and potentially dangerous situation. "It's not natural," commented Abigail Simmons, one of the local matriarchs and self-appointed moral authorities of the community. "A decent man like Jacob getting involved with, well, we all know what she is and what those children represent. How can he look at those girls without thinking about how they came to be?" But not everyone in the community shared this harsh judgment. Elenina Davis, despite her advanced age and her knowledge of the family's dark history, had developed a more compassionate view of the situation. She didn't do anything wrong. Elenina would reply firmly when people made disparaging comments about Martha. She was a victim, not a perpetrator, and those girls are completely innocent of whatever sins their parents committed. They deserve a chance at a normal life, and if Jacob Wheeler can help give them that chance, then more power to him. Meanwhile, in the mountain cabin, Martha struggled with internal demons that years of abuse had carved deep into her psyche. The nights were often the most difficult times, when the silence of the mountains would be broken by her own cries as nightmares dragged her back into the darkest memories of her past. "Sometimes I think I see him," she confessed to Jacob during one of his visits, her voice trembling as she described the psychological torment that continued to plague her. "Standing in the corner of the room or at the edge of the forest when I'm working in the garden. I know it's not real. I know he's dead and buried, but the image seems so vivid, so threatening." Jacob, who had no real understanding of what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, nevertheless understood instinctively that Martha needed more help than he alone could provide. He gently suggested that she might benefit from talking to someone with medical or psychological training, someone who could help her process the trauma she had endured. Martha initially resisted the idea, terrified of exposure and judgment from outsiders who might not understand her situation or who might blame her for what had happened. But when the nightmares began to affect her ability to function during the day, when she would find herself paralyzed with fear at unexpected sounds or unable to concentrate on simple tasks, she finally agreed to seek help. Dr. Richard Montgomery was a psychiatrist who traveled to the larger towns in the region once a month, providing mental health services to people who would otherwise have no access to such care. He was a progressive man for his time, educated at Johns Hopkins University, and influenced by the emerging understanding of psychological trauma that was beginning to develop in the medical community. Dr. Montgomery had studied the effects of prolonged trauma and abuse, and he understood that Martha's psychological symptoms were not the result of moral weakness or character defects, but rather natural responses to extraordinary and sustained psychological damage. His approach was revolutionary for the time. He treated Martha with respect and compassion rather than judgment, and he helped her understand that she was a survivor rather than a victim. With Dr. Montgomery's support and guidance, Martha slowly began the long, difficult process of psychological healing. It was a painful journey, filled with setbacks and moments of despair when the weight of her memories seemed too heavy to bear. But there were also small victories and glimpses of hope that suggested healing was possible, even after such severe trauma. During this period of gradual recovery, both Sarah and Ruth continued to develop in ways that brought Martha tremendous pride and hope for their futures. Sarah, now 7 years old, was flourishing in school, despite the occasional challenges she faced due to her genetic heritage. Her natural intelligence, combined with a fierce determination to learn and succeed, allowed her to overcome most of the academic difficulties that might have been expected given her parentage. Sarah's teacher, Ms. Wilson, was amazed by the girl's resilience and eagerness to learn. "She approaches every lesson with such intensity," Ms. Wilson noted in her teaching journal. "It's as if she understands instinctively that education is her pathway to a different kind of life, and she's determined not to waste the opportunity." Ruth, although she would never be capable of complete independence, was developing surprising skills that brought joy to everyone around her. Her needlework was becoming increasingly sophisticated, and she had developed an almost intuitive understanding of color and pattern that produced beautiful quilts and embroidered pieces. These creations not only provided her with a sense of accomplishment and purpose, but also began to attract attention from people outside the immediate community. But as the girls grew older, inevitable questions began to arise about their family history and their father's identity. Sarah, in particular, was beginning to ask the kinds of questions that Martha had been dreading for years. "Why don't I have a father like the other children at school?" Sarah asked one evening as Martha was helping her with her schoolwork. "Where did my father go, and why did he leave us?" Martha felt her hands begin to tremble as she tried to formulate an answer that would satisfy her daughter's curiosity without revealing the horrible truth that she was still far from ready to share. The glass of water she had been holding slipped slightly in her grip, and she had to set it down carefully to avoid spilling it. "Your grandfather Jeremiah took care of us after your father left," Martha finally said, choosing her words as carefully as possible. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it omitted the most crucial and devastating parts of the truth. "Jeremiah made sure we had everything we needed. But where did my father go?" Sarah persisted with the relentless curiosity of a child who senses that she's not getting complete answers to her questions. He wasn't ready to be a father," Martha replied, feeling the inadequacy of her words even as she spoke them. "Some men aren't prepared for that kind of responsibility." Sarah, with the intuitive perceptiveness that children often possess, realized that there was much more to the story than her mother was willing or able to share. But like many children in complicated family situations, she learned not to push too hard on certain sensitive topics, understanding somehow that some subjects caused her mother pain that was better left unexplored. In 1956, 3 years after Jeremiah's death, and during a period when Martha's psychological healing had progressed significantly, Jacob asked her to marry him. It was a simple, heartfelt proposal made during a picnic in a sunny mountain clearing near the cabin, a place where Sarah and Ruth often played and where Martha had begun to find some peace and happiness. Martha was genuinely surprised by the proposal, despite the growing closeness of their relationship. She had never imagined that any man would want to marry her after learning the truth about her past and the circumstances of her children's births. "Are you sure?" she asked, tears forming in her eyes as she struggled to believe that such happiness might actually be possible for someone like her. "After everything you know about me, about my past, about what I've done and what's been done to me?" Jacob took her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes with a steadiness and sincerity that she had never experienced from any man in her life. "I know you, Martha," he said quietly but firmly. "Not just your past, but who you are now. You're a survivor who refused to be broken by things that would have destroyed most people. You're a mother who would do anything for her daughters, who has sacrificed everything to protect them and give them whatever chance at happiness was possible. You're a woman with more genuine strength and courage than anyone I've ever known." Martha looked at him through her tears, still struggling to accept that such kindness and love might be real and permanent rather than temporary and conditional. "I don't know if I'll ever be completely normal," she said hesitantly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to be a wife in all the ways that you deserve. There are parts of me that may always be damaged, always be afraid." "I'm not asking you to be something you're not," Jacob replied with the gentle patience that had characterized their entire relationship. "I'm asking you to build something new with me, at our own pace and in our own way. We'll figure out everything else as we go." The wedding was a small, simple ceremony held in the cabin itself, with only a few close friends and neighbors as witnesses. Reverend Mitchell, who had watched Martha's transformation with amazement and admiration, performed the service with genuine joy at seeing this woman finally find some measure of happiness and security. Life as Mrs. Wheeler brought Martha a new sense of legitimacy and acceptance within the mountain community. People who had previously whispered about her with suspicion and judgment began to treat her with something approaching normal social respect. For Sarah and Ruth, Jacob's presence in their lives provided the first stable, positive male influence they had ever known. Jacob proved to be exactly the kind of father figure that the girls needed: patient, gentle, encouraging, and completely free of the threatening, dominating behaviors that they had learned to associate with adult men. Under his influence, both girls continued to flourish in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. But the past, as it often does, had a way of resurfacing when it was least expected and least welcome. In 1959, when Sarah was 13 years old, the same age, her mother had been when Jeremiah's systematic abuse began. She made a discovery that would shatter the carefully constructed normalcy that the family had built over the previous several years. While exploring the cabin's small attic space, looking for old books or items that might be useful for a school project, Sarah found an old wooden box hidden beneath some moth-eaten blankets and forgotten household items. Inside the box was her mother's diary, a small leather-bound book that Martha had begun writing in shortly after her own mother's death, when she was just 6 years old. The diary chronicled Martha's life from childhood through her teenage years and into early adulthood, providing a day-by-day account of the horror that had shaped her existence. The yellowed pages contain the raw, unfiltered truth about Jeremiah's abuse, the circumstances of Sarah's conception and birth, the esophony, genetic problems that had affected her siblings, and the deaths of children whose bodies couldn't survive the consequences of incestuous parentage. The diary entries revealed not just the facts of what had happened, but also the psychological impact on Martha, her desperate attempts to resist, her feelings of guilt and shame, her love for her children, despite the circumstances of their conception, and her long struggle to maintain some sense of hope and humanity in the face of sustained brutality. When Martha came upstairs and found Sarah sitting on the small bed, the diary open in her lap and silent tears streaming down her face, a chill of horror spread through her body, followed by a wave of nausea so intense that she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "Is it true?" Sarah asked, her voice small and broken, barely above a whisper. "What it says in here about grandfather Jeremiah being my father. Is it really true?" Martha closed her eyes as if she could somehow block out the reality of this moment that she had dreaded for years. She had hoped that Sarah would never need to know the complete truth, that the carefully constructed fiction about an absent father might be sufficient to allow her daughter to build a normal life without the burden of knowing about her origins. But when she opened her eyes again, Sarah was still there, still waiting for an answer that would fundamentally change her understanding of herself and her place in the world. "Yes," Martha finally said, the single word emerging like a painful sigh that carried years of suppressed truth. "Yes, it's all true." The revelation of the complete truth about her parentage devastated Sarah in ways that took months to fully manifest. The intelligent, confident 13-year-old who had been thriving in school and dreaming about her future suddenly became withdrawn, silent, and consumed with questions about her own identity and worth. She stopped attending school for several weeks, claiming illness but actually unable to face her classmates and teachers while carrying the knowledge of what she now knew about herself. She became convinced that somehow her origins were visible to others, that people could look at her face and see the mark of incest that she believed defined her existence. "I'm a freak," she told Martha during one of their painful conversations about the situation. "Half of my genes come from the same source as the other half. Is that why Ruth is the way she is? Is that why my older siblings died? And what about me? What's wrong with me that we haven't discovered yet?" Martha, her heart breaking for her daughter's pain, but determined not to retreat into the lies and evasions that had characterized so much of their family's existence, decided to explain everything as honestly and completely as possible. She told Sarah about the genetic risks associated with consanguinity, why some children are more severely affected than others, and the apparent fact that Sarah had somehow escaped the worst physical and mental consequences that had affected her siblings. "But that doesn't mean I'm okay," Sarah argued, her voice filled with the despair and self-doubt that Martha recognized from her own darkest moments. "What if I have children someday? Will they inherit this contamination? Will I pass on whatever damage is hidden in my genes?" It was Jacob who suggested that they consult with a specialist in human genetics, a relatively new field of medicine that was beginning to provide scientific answers to questions about heredity and genetic disorders. After exchanging letters with several universities, they were able to arrange a consultation with Dr. Benjamin Rosen, a Jewish physician who worked at the University of Pennsylvania and was known for his pioneering research in human genetics. The journey to Philadelphia was a major undertaking for the family, requiring several days of travel and significant expense that stretched their modest resources. But Jacob and Martha both understood that Sarah needed answers from someone with real scientific knowledge, rather than the speculation and folk wisdom that had always surrounded such questions in their mountain community. Dr. Rosen proved to be exactly the kind of professional that Sarah needed to speak with. He was a man who had himself experienced prejudice and discrimination, and he understood the psychological impact that genetic concerns could have on a young person's sense of self-worth and future possibilities. "You are not a freak, my dear," he told Sarah after conducting a comprehensive examination and reviewing the family history that Martha had courageously provided. "You are a young woman who had the misfortune to be born under difficult circumstances, but those circumstances do not define who you are or limit who you can become." Dr. Rosen spent considerable time explaining to Sarah how human genetics actually works, describing how every person carries potentially problematic recessive genes, but that these genes typically cause problems only when they are paired with identical genes from another parent who shares the same genetic heritage. "If you choose to marry someone who has no genetic connection to your family lineage," he explained, "your children will almost certainly be as healthy as any other children. The important thing is ensuring that your future partner comes from a completely different genetic background with no connection to the Hollister family line." He also explained to Sarah that her apparent normalcy, her intelligence, her physical health, her emotional stability, were all positive indicators that she had not inherited the most serious genetic problems that had affected some of her siblings. The consultation with Dr. Rosen marked a crucial turning point in Sarah's psychological recovery from the devastating revelation about her origins. While the truth about her parentage remained painful and would always be a part of her personal history, she began to separate that historical fact from her identity as an individual with her own dreams, goals, and possibilities for the future. She was not just the daughter of incest, she was Sarah Wheeler, having officially taken Jacob's surname when he married her mother. She was an intelligent young woman with academic abilities that could take her places that previous generations of mountain people had never imagined possible. She had loving parents in Martha and Jacob, and she had the opportunity to create her own life on her own terms. Life in the mountain cabin gradually found a new equilibrium as the family adjusted to this new reality of shared truth rather than hidden secrets. Ruth, now 18 years old and functioning at her maximum capacity despite her developmental limitations, continued to develop her remarkable talent for needlework and crafts. Her quilts and tapestries were beginning to gain recognition beyond the local community, with people from neighboring counties commissioning pieces and praising her intuitive understanding of color, pattern, and design. In 1962, Sarah, now 16 years old, and academically successful despite the challenges she had faced, met Michael Prescott, a young man whose presence in their isolated mountain community was unusual and significant. Michael was the son of a university professor who had come to the Appalachian region to conduct research on traditional mountain culture, music, and folklore as part of his doctoral studies in anthropology. Michael was different from the local mountain boys in ways that immediately appealed to Sarah's intellectual curiosity and ambitions. He was well-educated, well-traveled, and filled with ideas about the world beyond the mountains that Sarah had only read about in books. Their friendship developed around shared interests in learning, reading, and discussing ideas that went far beyond the practical concerns of mountain life. As their friendship deepened into romance, Sarah faced the terrifying prospect of revealing her family history to someone she had come to love and respect. She was convinced that once Michael learned the truth about her origins, he would be repulsed and would end their relationship immediately. When Sarah finally gathered the courage to tell Michael about her family's dark secrets, she was amazed by his response. Rather than reacting with horror or rejection, Michael surprised her with both his compassion and his own family history. "My father is Jewish," he told her, taking her hands in his as she wept with relief at his acceptance. "My grandparents escaped the pogroms in Eastern Europe and came to America with nothing but hope for a better life. I know what it's like to carry the weight of family history that others might use to judge you. I know what it means to be defined by things that happened before you were born, things that you had no control over." Michael's acceptance and understanding provided Sarah with something she had never expected to find, a partner who could love her completely while knowing the complete truth about her past. Their relationship flourished as Sarah completed her final years of high school with academic distinction that caught the attention of educators beyond their local community. When Sarah received a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University, an extraordinary achievement for any young woman from their isolated mountain community, but especially remarkable given her background, Michael supported her decision completely and encouraged her to pursue her dreams of higher education and a professional career. Martha watched her daughter's development and success with a mixture of pride, amazement, and Sarah was proving that the circumstances of her birth did not have to determine the course of her life, that with love, support, and opportunity, even someone with the most difficult origins could create a meaningful and successful future. In 1965, during Sarah's final year of nursing school, she and Michael were married in a beautiful ceremony in the university chapel. Martha, dressed in a light blue outfit that Jacob had insisted on buying for her, had never looked more radiant than at the moment when she watched her daughter walking down the aisle toward a future that she herself could never have imagined during her own darkest years. The sight of Sarah in her wedding dress, confident and happy and surrounded by friends from her nursing program, represented everything that Martha had hoped for but never dared to expect. Her daughter was not just surviving despite her origins, she was thriving, creating a life filled with love, purpose, and possibilities. That same year, Dr. Montgomery approached Martha with an unusual but potentially important request. The field of psychology and psychiatry was beginning to recognize the prevalence and long-term impact of child abuse and incest, topics that had previously been almost completely taboo in both medical and social circles. Your experience, if shared anonymously, could help mental health professionals better understand how to identify and assist other victims. He explained to Martha during one of their sessions. More importantly, it could help other women and girls in similar situations realize that they are not alone, that survival and recovery are possible even after the most severe trauma. The idea of sharing her story, even anonymously, terrified Martha initially. She had spent so many years hiding the truth, protecting herself and her family from judgment and exposure, that the concept of deliberately revealing their secrets seemed almost incomprehensible. But after months of careful consideration and extensive discussions with Jacob, Sarah, and Ruth, Martha agreed to participate in an academic study on survivors of prolonged family abuse. Her case, published in psychological journals under the pseudonym Patient H, became one of the most frequently cited examples in the emerging literature on trauma, resilience, and recovery. The publication of Martha's story, even in the disguised form required for academic research, represented a final step in her journey from victim to survivor to someone whose experience could potentially help others facing similar challenges. In 1970, Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 29. The cause of death was heart failure, probably related to the genetic conditions that she had carried since birth, but which had been managed well enough to allow her nearly 30 years of life that, while limited in some ways, had been filled with love, creativity, and accomplishment. Ruth's death was peaceful, occurring during the night while she was surrounded by her beloved quilts, tapestries, and embroidery work, the beautiful creations that had allowed her to express herself and contribute to her family's life in ways that transcended her intellectual limitations. Sarah, now a respected nurse and the mother of 2 healthy children, Elizabeth, age 5, and James, age 3. It was the first time that Elizabeth and James had visited the isolated cabin where their mother had grown up, and the experience was both educational and emotionally powerful for the entire family. Martha, now 53 years old, and showing her age after a lifetime of hardship and stress, watched her grandchildren playing in the same mountain clearing where she herself had played as a child, where Sarah had taken her first steps, and where Ruth had spent countless hours sitting in the sunlight working on her needlework projects. There was a profound sense of continuity in watching these healthy, happy children enjoying the beauty and freedom of the mountains, but there was also an equally profound sense of the necessary break with the past that their existence represented. They'll never know, will they? Martha asked Sarah as they watched Elizabeth and James exploring the woods and streams that had been such an important part of their family's life, about Jeremiah, about everything that happened in that cabin, about the darkness that once filled this place. Sarah looked at her mother with eyes that held both Jeremiah's blue color and a wisdom and compassion that were entirely her own creation. One day, when they're much older and better able to understand, I'll tell them a version of the story, she replied thoughtfully. Not all the details, certainly not the most disturbing parts, but enough for them to understand where we came from and what we overcame as a family. I want them to know about their grandmother's incredible strength and courage. I want them to understand how you broke a cycle of abuse and trauma that could have continued for additional generations. Martha felt tears forming in her eyes as she considered the implications of her daughter's words and the reality of what their family had accomplished despite the most difficult circumstances imaginable. "Do you really think it's possible?" she asked. "Really breaking a cycle that had been going on for so many generations. Can we be sure that the damage won't somehow continue?" Sarah smiled with an expression that carried equal measures of hard-won knowledge and genuine hope for the future. "Look at them, Mom," she said, gesturing toward Elizabeth and James as they played happily in the mountain sunshine. "Look at me, at Michael, at the life we've built together. Look at you and Jacob and the love you found after so much suffering. We've already broken it. The cycle of abuse and trauma that might have continued indefinitely ended with your courage and your determination to protect your children, regardless of personal cost. In that moment, as the late afternoon sun set behind the ancient Appalachian mountains, casting the clearing and golden light that seemed to bless everything it touched, Martha Hollister Wheeler finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the sins and tragedies of previous generations need not be visited upon their children and grandchildren. With sufficient love, courage, determination, and truth, even when that truth was painful and difficult, it was possible for even the darkest family stories to give way to new beginnings, fresh hope, and the possibility of genuine happiness for future generations. The years continued to pass, and the mountains remained silent witnesses to both the pain of previous generations and the healing that had followed. The old Hollister cabin, eventually abandoned after the deaths of Martha and Jacob in the winter of 1985, slowly returned to the earth as nature reclaimed what had once been a place of such suffering and, ultimately, recovery. The small family cemetery became a peaceful place, visited occasionally by Sarah and later by her children and grandchildren, who would come to pay their respects to family members they had never known, but whose stories had become part of their own family heritage. The story of the Hollister Wheeler family lives on, primarily in academic memory now, preserved in the archives of studies on family abuse, trauma, and human resilience. What began as a cycle of abuse and genetic tragedy became, through the extraordinary courage and determination of one woman and the love of those who supported her, a narrative of triumph over the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Their story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest situations, hope and healing remain possible for those with sufficient courage to seek them, and that the cycles of abuse and trauma that seem insurmountable can indeed be broken by individuals who refuse to accept that their past must determine their future. This has been another exploration into the hidden histories that shaped American families, by Holloway Archives. If this story has moved you or given you insights into the resilience of the human spirit, please let us know in the comments. And remember to subscribe for more forgotten tales of survival, courage, and the complex realities of American family life that often remain hidden from the history books.